Montana Territory, June 1883. The wind was dry and sharp that morning, sweeping over the high plains like it had somewhere to be. Gwen Gardner gripped the reins tighter as her old wagon jolted over a rut in the dirt road. Her two children, Lottie and Levy, huddled close together in the back, wrapped in a patchwork quilt. The heat would come later, but the morning held a chill that settled in Gwen's bones. She had not slept the night before, not since the man she trusted rode off with their money and left them stranded at the edge of nowhere. She had not cried, not in front of the children. But now, with nothing but sagebrush, dust, and the sun creeping higher, she felt the weight of it press in. Lottie was 5, Levy barely 3. She had to keep them safe, keep them alive. The town of Dry Creek was still a half-day's ride away and the horses were tired. She had no choice but to keep going. There was no one coming to help, no family left, no friends, except maybe one. She had not seen him in almost 10 years. Not since she was 17 and he was 18, and they had stood under the cottonwood tree by the river, too young and too proud to admit they were in love. His name had been Holden Decker. He had left Dry Creek to join a cattle drive down through New Mexico, promising he would write. He never had. And Gwen, shamed by her father's debts and her mother's illness, had married a man she did not love just to survive. That man was gone, now dead 2 winters ago. And the man who promised her help last week had vanished with the last of her savings, so now she was headed back to Dry Creek, back to Holden if he was even still there. She had no promise he would help her, no reason to believe he would even remember who she was, but she had nothing else. The sun was high when the left wagon wheel cracked. The wagon lurched hard to the right and dropped, the axle thudding into the dust. Gwen barely managed to pull the horses to a stop before the whole thing tipped. She jumped down, boots sinking into the dry dirt. Lottie peeked over the edge, eyes wide. "Is it broken?" she asked. Gwen swallowed hard. "It is, but we will be all right." They were not. She had no tools, no spare wheel, no way to fix it. She could carry one child maybe, but not both, and not all the food they had left. She stood there, staring at the broken wheel, her heart sinking fast. Then she heard it, a single hoofbeat, then another, then the steady rhythm of a horse coming fast over the ridge. Gwen turned, shielding her eyes from the sun. The rider slowed as he came down the slope, dust curling behind his mount. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle slung across his back, button-up shirt rolled at the sleeves. His face was leaner, older, but she knew that jaw, those eyes, the way he carried himself in the saddle. Holden Decker pulled his horse to a stop and stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. Gwen, her throat tightened. "Hello, Holden." He dismounted in one swift move and walked toward her. "What happened?" He glanced at the wagon, the wheel, the children. The wheel cracked. "We were headed to Dry Creek. You walked all the way from the pass." "No, we drove. Until now." He looked at the children, then back at her. "Who are they?" Gwen's voice was low. "My children, Lottie and Levy." Holden's jaw shifted slightly, but his eyes softened. "Where's their father?" "Gone." He nodded once. "You need help." She nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "All right," he said. "Let's get you out of here." He turned without another word, tied her horses to his, then lifted Levy into one arm and motioned for Lottie to come forward. Then he looked at her. "You ride with me. We will come back for the wagon." She hesitated, but there was no room for pride. She climbed up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her cheek resting lightly against his back. They rode toward Dry Creek, the sun behind them, the wind quieter now. Holden said nothing for a while, letting the silence settle. Then softly he asked, "Where have you been all these years?" "Trying to survive," she said. He nodded again. "You always did have grit." The town came into view by late afternoon, small, dusty, just a few buildings and a row of trees that had somehow managed to stay green. Holden turned his horse toward the edge of town, where a small cabin sat behind the blacksmith shop. He helped her down, then carried Levy inside. "You can stay here," he said. "It is mine. I built it when I came back from Texas last spring." Lottie ran straight to the hearth, Levy to the cot in the corner. Gwen stood in the doorway, unsure. You do not owe me anything, Holden. He turned. I know, I want to help. She nodded, and for a moment they just looked at each other. 10 years of silence between them, but not anger, not anymore, just something quieter, sadder. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Gwen found him outside, sitting on the porch, his long legs stretched out, a tin cup in his hand. She sat beside him. Why did you never write? She asked finally. He looked at the stars. I did once, but I heard you married. Figured you made your choice. I did not have much of one, she said. He looked at her then, really looked. I never stopped thinking about you, Gwen. She looked down at her hands. I did not think I would ever see you again. He reached over, slow, and took her hand lightly in his. You are here now. She nodded, and for the first time since her husband died, since her money disappeared, since the world turned against her, she felt something steady under her feet, hope, and Holden's hand warm around hers. The morning after their arrival in Dry Creek, the rooster crowed before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. Gwen sat on a stool beside the hearth, brushing Lottie's hair in slow, careful strokes. The girl winced now and then, but didn't complain. Levi still slept, curled deep beneath the quilt, his small hand tucked under his cheek. Outside, Holden split kindling with a practiced rhythm, the steady crack of the axe echoing against the stillness. His cabin sat far enough from the center of town that no one wandered past unless they meant to. It was quiet here. Gwen wasn't used to quiet that didn't carry threat in it. Lottie turned her head. Are we staying here? Gwen paused, just for a little while. Does the man live here always? Gwen nodded once. Is he nice? He's kind, she said, tying off the braid. Lottie mulled that over and said no more. By the time Levi stirred, Holden was back inside, hands scrubbed and clean, the scent of fresh wood dust still clinging to his sleeves. Gwen stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I should find work, she said, her voice low so as not to wake the boy fully. Holden leaned against the doorframe. There's a widow in town, runs the mercantile, Mrs. Finley. Her knees are bad. She's been looking for someone to manage the counter in the mornings. Would she take me on? She might if I ask her. Gwen looked down at her boots. I can ask her myself. He didn't argue. I'll watch the little ones while you go. She hesitated. You have your own work. I'll manage. She met his eyes. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. That was all he said, and it was enough. She nodded, lifted her shawl from the peg, and stepped out into the morning. Dry Creek's Main Street was little more than 2 dusty lanes and a scattering of buildings, but it was busy already. A wagon full of hay rolled past, pulled by a team of bays. 2 boys chased each other near the livery, hooting and laughing. Gwen kept her head down and walked straight to the mercantile. Mrs. Finley was narrow-shouldered and sharp-eyed, her hair pulled back so tight it made her temples shine. She didn't smile when Gwen entered, but she didn't scowl either. You're the Gardner woman, she said, voice rasped from years of pipe smoke. Yes, ma'am. You with Holden Decker now. I'm staying at his place for the time being. Mrs. Finley studied her. You have a decent hand with figures. I used to keep the books for our store back in Kansas. Before we lost it. The older woman gave a short nod. Come at 6 tomorrow. Shelves need dusting before the doors open. Gwen's relief didn't show on her face. Thank you. You bring your own apron. I don't keep extras. I will. She left without lingering. On the walk back, she passed the post office, a squat little building with a warped roof. A man inside was reading through a bundle of letters, frowning at them like they'd personally wronged him. Gwen slowed, remembering the ad she'd answered months ago, long before she'd met the man who stole the last of her money. The ad had promised land, a fresh start, and a husband who valued hard work over dowry. She'd written back with hope in every line. Told the truth about her children, about her widowhood, about what little she could offer. He replied once, asked for a photo. She didn't have one. That was the end of it. She hadn't known then how much rejection could ache when it came quiet and final like that. Back at the cabin, Levi sat on Holden's knee, solemnly inspecting a carved wooden horse. Lottie was on the floor, drawing shapes in the ash with a stick. Gwen stepped inside, brushed the dust from her skirt. She said yes, she murmured. Holden gave a small tilt of his head in acknowledgement. You'll do good there, he rose, setting Levy down gently. I've got fencing work south of the ridge. I'll be gone through the afternoon. I can manage, Gwen said. He started toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. You didn't tell me what brought you west in the first place. Gwen folded her arms, leaning against the table. I answered an ad. Holden waited. Man in Idaho territory. Said he wanted a wife who could sew and cook and didn't mind hard work. I sent a letter. Told him everything. What'd he say? Said I didn't have enough to offer, that he'd found someone with a better situation. Holden's jaw set, but he didn't speak. She looked down. I thought maybe that was my last chance. You were wrong. He stepped outside. The door shut behind him with a quiet click. Gwen turned, watching her children. Levy was galloping the little horse across the hearthstones. Lottie had begun humming, soft and tuneless, but content. She crossed to the wash basin, rolled up her sleeves, and began scrubbing a few shirts in the cold water. Her hands were raw by the time she finished, but her shoulders felt lighter. The day passed without hurry. She swept the floor, boiled beans, patched a tear in Levy's trousers. Every task reminded her she was still standing, still moving forward. That night, Holden returned with dust on his boots and a new splinter in his thumb. Gwen had already tucked the children in. She met him on the porch, a cup of warm cider in her hand. I left some supper on the stove, she said. Appreciate it? They sat for a long while in silence, listening to the wind shift through the cottonwoods. Finally, Holden spoke. You ever think about leaving the territory? Sometimes, but there's nothing back east for me. He took the cup when she offered it. Their fingers brushed and neither pulled away. You've got a place here, Gwen, if you want it. She turned her head toward him. You sure? I built this place for a future. Didn't know what it'd look like, but maybe this is it. She didn't answer right away. Just watched the stars settling into place above them, the shape of the world shifting in ways she hadn't expected. I'd like that, she said at last, and this time there was no question in her voice. The next morning broke with cloud cover, dim and thick as wool. Gwen stood behind the mercantile counter, sleeves rolled and apron tied snug at the waist. The oil lamp swung slightly overhead, stirred by a draft from the warped front door. She was wiping down a row of molasses tins when Mrs. Finley called from the back room. Put those crates by the pickle barrel. Don't let them sit long or the florals swell under him. Gwen did as told, her hands steady even when the crate's edge bit into her palm. The ache in her wrist from scrubbing shirts the day before flared sharp, but she didn't pause. A man with a crooked shoulder and a tobacco-stained beard came in around mid-morning, nodding at Gwen as he passed. She nodded back, polite but brief. He bought a sack of flour and said little else when the door closed behind him, Mrs. Finley emerged from the back, wiping her hands on a rag that had long ago given up being clean. You settle in all right at Decker's place? Yes, ma'am. I knew his mother, before the fever took her. She never took to showy things, but she raised him to be steady. That counts for more than most admit. Gwen didn't answer. She didn't know how to, not without showing more of herself than she was ready to lay bare. Mrs. Finley narrowed her eyes. You plan to stay in town? I don't know yet. Well, she said, turning toward the back, the land listens better when you stop trying to outrun everything. Gwen finished her shift at noon, tucked her apron away, and stepped back into the brisk light. The clouds hadn't lifted. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked toward the edge of town, where the dirt road forked between the church and the schoolhouse. A group of children played marbles under the eaves, laughing too loud for the teacher's liking. Gwen paused a moment, watching them. Lottie would need schooling come fall. When she reached the cabin, Levy ran to her barefoot and grinning, a strip of rag tied around his head like a band. Lottie followed, holding a flat stone painted with stripes of red and green. Gwen raised her eyebrows. Where did you get paint? Lottie pointed toward the barn. Holden showed us the old wagon boards. He said I could use what was left. Gwen crouched beside her daughter, brushing wind-blown hair back from her face. You thank him? Lottie nodded, solemn. He said I had steady hands. Inside, a pan of biscuits cooled on the table. Holden was outside again, mending a strip of leather reins. Gwen stepped out onto the porch and leaned against the post. You've done more than I expected. He didn't look up. I don't expect anything back, I know. That's what makes it harder. He stood, wiping his hands on the leg of his trousers. You're not the only one who's been left behind. She watched him for a moment. What happened? Years back, I worked cattle up through the Judith Basin, met a girl in Helena, doctor's daughter. Thought I could make something of it. What changed? She wanted a man with land already deeded. I didn't have that. Said I was still chasing things that might not come. And now I've got land, no one to share it with till last week. Gwen shifted her weight. You think it's that simple? No, but I think it's worth trying. That evening, he brought in a bundle of willow switches and laid them on the porch. I'm building a fence to keep the deer from the garden. Figured you might want to plant come spring. I haven't had a garden since Kansas. You remember how? Some of it. I'll show you the soil come morning. She nodded and stepped inside to check the stew. Lottie had set the table crooked but careful. Levy had lined up 3 stones on the windowsill, each one darker than the next. They ate quiet, the way people do when the day has left them tired but not undone. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, Gwen walked out back. The wind had stilled. Holden was by the shed, lantern hung from a nail, checking the hinges on the door. I heard from Mrs. Finley that you plan to plant barley this season, she said. He looked over. I do. South field's ready. You'll need help turning soil. I'd welcome it. She stepped closer. I can't offer much, but I'm good with my hands, and I don't quit. He set the hammer down. That's more than enough. They stood with only the soft flicker of the lantern between them. Gwen looked at his face, the way time and sun had carved along his brow, how still he held himself, like someone who'd learned to wait instead of chase. Holden, she said, voice low, I didn't expect to feel safe again. He didn't answer right away. Just stepped forward close enough that his warmth reached her. You are, he said. Here you are. She didn't look away. I'd like to stay if you'll have me. His hand rose slow and he touched her cheek like he was afraid she'd vanish. I've been waiting a long time, he said. You're the first thing that's felt right. Gwen leaned into him, the shape of her fitting against the shape of him like something tried and true. The night held around them, quiet and whole. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that a life could be built again, one fence post, one seed, one morning at a time. By the first week of July, the ground had begun to crack from heat. Rain hadn't touched Dry Creek in nearly 2 weeks, and the grass along the ridge above Holden's pasture had gone the color of old straw. Gwen rose before the sun, careful not to wake the children, and joined Holden in the field before the light had fully taken the chill off the prairie. He handed her a spade without speaking. Together they worked in long stretches of silence, breaking the soil for the kitchen garden he'd cleared beside the cabin. The ground was stubborn and dry, but Gwen's arms were stronger now, the ache in her shoulders no longer unfamiliar. When they paused to drink from the water pail, Holden nodded toward the ridge. Wild plums grow up there. Come August, they'll be ripe enough to jar. Gwen wiped her brow with her sleeve. I've never seen a plum tree in the open like that. They hang on, even when there's no reason they should. He said it without looking at her, but she understood. That afternoon, she walked with Lottie to the schoolhouse. Miss Elwell, the teacher from Illinois, stood near the doorway, her dress clinging to her legs in the wind. She wore wire spectacles and kept her hair pinned in the same tight coil every day. I brought my daughter to meet you, Gwen said. Miss Elwell nodded, then crouched in front of Lottie. Do you know your letters? Lottie nodded shyly. Most of them. We'll make sure you know the rest. On the walk back, Gwen glanced down at her daughter's face. You'll like it there. She's strict, but fair. Lottie didn't answer, but she reached up and took her mother's hand, swinging it lightly in the air between them. That evening, Holden returned from the south pasture with a scrape along his forearm. Gwen took a clean strip of cloth from her basket and dipped it in warm water. Fence post split, he explained. Snapped back when I wasn't watching. She wrapped the cloth around his arm with slow, practiced hands. You ought to let me help with that fencing tomorrow. He studied her face. You'll have your hands full once you start at the mercantile full days. I've done more on less rest, he didn't argue. All right. She tied the cloth off, letting her fingers linger a breath too long. When she pulled away, he caught her wrist gently. My uncle used to say a place isn't real until there's a woman's work in the soil and a child's handprint on the wall. Gwen looked past him, through the open window where Levy was sleeping on the cot with one foot hanging off the edge. There's both here now, she said. He let her hand go, but not the moment. Later, after the children had gone quiet, Gwen sat on the floor near the hearth, sorting through the small bundle of seeds she'd brought in her satchel months ago. Most were old beans, a few squash, and she wasn't sure which would take in this ground. Still, she lined them up in a row across the floor, organizing by what she knew could stand the wind. Holden knelt beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. That all you've got, she nodded. Some were my mother's. She used to save them in paper folded tight as envelopes. He reached for one of the beans, turning it over in his palm. We'll get more. Come autumn, I'll ride up to Fort Benton. Traders bring seed stock from the coast. You do that? I would. They sat there, knees nearly touching. The fire burned low. She could hear the crickets starting up outside near the cedar fence. Holden's voice was quiet. I've been thinking about building onto the house. She looked at him sideways. What for? For you? And the children? One room's not enough. Gwen didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, I've never had a man build anything for me before. I've never had reason to. She reached for the last seed, a hard little kernel of corn. Her fingers brushed his again. You're sure? I'm certain. They stayed like that, floor cool beneath them, past the hour they usually turned in. When she finally rose, her knees stiff, he followed her to the door and held it open. Outside, the moon hung low over the hills, casting silver over the dry earth. Gwen stepped out, turned back, and looked at him in the doorway. I never wanted to be chosen because I was convenient, she said. Holden's hand rested lightly on the frame. You weren't. She nodded once, and in that nod was every answer she'd never gotten in a letter, every door closed behind her, and every mile that had brought her west. Inside, the cabin was warm with sleep. She lay down beside Levy and pulled the quilt over both of them, the scent of sun-dried cotton and soap faint in the folds. Holden's boots thudded softly as he crossed to his own bed across the room. Neither of them said good night. They didn't need to. The soil gave easier after the second rain. Gwen stood barefoot in the garden, toes sunk into the soft loam, guiding Lottie's hand as they pressed squash seeds into the damp earth. A robin chattered from the fence post behind them, wings twitching against the breeze. Levy sat nearby with a spoon and a bucket, scooping mud into shapes only he seemed to understand. Holden stepped around the corner of the cabin carrying a length of canvas over one shoulder. He didn't speak until he reached them. I've got lumber coming in from 3 Forks next week. Should be enough to frame the new room. Gwen looked up, brushing her sleeve across her forehead. You already ordered it, traded for it. He set the canvas down beside the porch. Used some extra hides I'd been holding back. She stood, wiping her hands on the back of her skirt. You didn't ask what I thought. I didn't have to. Her mouth tugged into a quiet smile. You're certain this is what you want? I am. She didn't answer right away, but the nod she gave him held weight. Levy splashed in his bucket behind them, unconcerned with futures. Lottie picked up a seed and pressed it down on her own, her brow furrowed in concentration. That evening, Gwen found a patch of dry calico and began sewing curtains from the cloth she'd salvaged from her old dress. Her stitches were small, tight not for show but for keeping. Holden sat across from her, carving the beginnings of a small stool from a block of pine. You ever think you'd end up here? He asked. She didn't pause in her sewing. Not once. Do you regret it? Gwen tied off the thread and set the cloth in her lap. No, The oil lamp between them flickered as the wind shifted outside. Somewhere past the barn, the first crickets started up. "I've been thinking," Holden said. "We could put the new room on the north end. Give the children space of their own. They'd like that. And later, if we ever needed more, I could build out toward the pasture." She looked at him across the table. "You're planning far ahead. I want you to know I'm not waiting for anything better to come along." Gwen folded the fabric carefully. "I never thought you were." In the following days, Holden cleared the brush behind the cabin while Gwen worked afternoons at the mercantile. Lottie stayed with Miss Elwell, helping with the younger children. Levy trailed after Holden, dragging a stick behind him like a plow. When the lumber wagon arrived, the boy sat on the porch and counted every board aloud, though he never got past 7 before starting over. "Mrs. Finley handed Gwen a wrapped parcel one afternoon as she closed up shop. "Found this in the back. No label. Looks like a child's book. You might as well take it." At home, Gwen read it aloud to Lottie and Levy that evening as the wind scratched against the windows. Holden leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, listening without interruption. Later, once the children were tucked in, Gwen pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out onto the porch. Holden followed, handing her a small tin cup of warm cider. "I saw you reading to them." She cradled the cup in both hands. "They've never had much that was just theirs, not before. They do now." She looked up at him. "I used to believe I was used up. Like I'd worn out all the parts of me that had anything soft left. I never saw you that way, I know." Her voice was rough with wind and something deeper. "That's why I can breathe again." Holden reached for her hand. "Then let's not waste any more time." They married beneath the cottonwood near the river, the same one where they'd stood once as teenagers, too proud to speak what they felt. Miss Elwell stood behind them with the children flanking either side. Mrs. Finley brought a loaf of bread and a jar of apple preserves. No preacher could be spared, so Holden spoke his vows with his hat in his hand, voice steady and low. "I'll carry what's mine," he said, "and I'll carry some of yours too. We'll make a home of whatever we've got." Gwen didn't cry, but her hands trembled when she placed the ring he'd carved from bone on his finger. In the weeks that followed, the new room took shape. Levy moved his pile of stones to the corner near the window. Lottie strung colored thread between 2 nails and hung her painted rocks like ornaments. Gwen planted 4 rows of beans, 2 of squash, and a patch of herbs near the door. Her hands were calloused and her back ached, but at night, when Holden curled beside her beneath the quilt, the weight of his arm across her waist made sleep come easy. By the first frost, the garden had gone to seed and the children had memorized every page of the storybook. Gwen sat on the porch with Holden, her shawl draped across both their shoulders, watching the sky deepen into autumn. "You think we'll be all right?" she asked. Holden kissed the side of her head. "We already are." The wind rolled over the hills, cool and full of promise. The land had turned gold and red, the light softer now, as if it too understood what it meant to finally rest. And in the cabin behind them, laughter bubbled beneath the rafters, not loud but sure. They stayed there, warm beside each other, knowing they'd built something lasting not out of luck or ease but from the pieces they'd carried alone for too long, now fitted together whole.